The clock strikes 5 a.m. on September 14, 2008. Aeroflot Flight 821 is moments from its final destination, Perm, Russia. The Boeing 737 is spiraling out of control. The crew is frantic. The aircraft rolls sharply to the right, and the altitude begins to plummet at an alarming rate. In the cockpit, the captain's voice shakes with frustration. "We're going down. Adjust the speed. Now!" But the co-pilot, already overwhelmed, doesn't respond in time. Panic is thick in the air as the plane descends rapidly, the ground rushing up. Outside the cockpit, air traffic control watches helplessly, powerless to stop the disaster unfolding. What caused a healthy aircraft to fall from the sky, and what could have been done to stop it? Stay with us as we reveal the shocking truth behind this disaster. A story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about cockpit safety. This is Inside Aero Disasters. It was the night of September 14th, 2008 at Sheremetyevo International Airport in Moscow. Aeroflot Nord's Flight 821 was preparing for takeoff. Its destination, the city of Perm. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-500, was scheduled to fly 82 passengers and 6 crew members on a routine flight. But the flight would be anything but routine. The aircraft, a 16-year-old Boeing 737-500, had a long history, operating in various countries before being leased by Aeroflot in early 2008. It had accumulated over 44,500 flight hours and had just completed a routine inspection earlier that year. On paper, everything seemed fine. Captain Rodion Medvedev, 34 years old, and co-pilot Rustam Alarin, 43 years old, were in the cockpit preparing for the flight. Medvedev had over 3,600 flight hours, including 450 hours as a captain on the Boeing 737. Alarin, though more experienced overall with over 8,700 flight hours, was still relatively new to the Boeing 737, with just 219 hours on the aircraft. They performed their initial pre-flight checks and were ready to depart, unaware that the subtle signs of disaster were already beginning to take shape. The weather at their destination, Perm, included some light rain and fog, but nothing severe enough to cause concern. However, there were already cracks in the foundation of this flight. Medvedev, the captain, was reviewing the aircraft's technical log and noticed a few issues. The auto-throttle system was marked as inoperative, but upon checking, he discovered it was actually functional. This was a minor oversight, but another error was lurking. The plane's TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System, was also listed as inoperative, but the crew was permitted to operate without it. This wasn't considered a major concern at the time. However, as the captain and co-pilot continued their preparations, they had no way of knowing how these small technical issues would add up to a much larger disaster. What no one knew was that Captain Medvedev had spent the previous night celebrating the birth of his child. He had been drinking heavily with friends, and although he had passed the medical check before the flight, the effects of alcohol were already starting to take a toll on him. Despite his earlier celebrations, he didn't seem outwardly impaired during pre-flight preparations. However, some flight attendants noticed a slight slur in his voice as he made an announcement to the passengers. But there were no official reports or suspicions raised. The flight proceeded as normal. At 3:06 a.m., Flight 821 received clearance for takeoff. The aircraft began taxiing down runway 7R, gradually accelerating as the engines roared to life. The Boeing 737 lifted off, climbing through the misty sky. The flight had officially begun, but the crew's actions and the captain's state of mind would soon set the course for disaster. Little did anyone know, there was already a growing problem in the cockpit, a small but significant mistake. The co-pilot, Alarin, was inputting the aircraft's coordinates into the Flight Management System, FMS, but there was a misalignment of the IRS, Inertial Reference System. This caused a 1 nautical mile error in the plane's position right from the start. A minor error, but one that would only get worse as the flight continued. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, everything seemed routine. But beneath the surface, the flight was already on a course for trouble. The small errors, the overlooked issues, and the captain's state of mind were slowly converging toward an inevitable outcome. The calm before the storm was about to end. Flight 821 was cruising smoothly at 29,855 feet, the night sky blanketing Moscow below. The crew, though experienced, were beginning to show signs of strain. The plane was now about 1 hour into its flight. From the cockpit, everything seemed routine, but the undercurrents of tension were already beginning to show. As the flight progressed, Captain Medvedev and co-pilot Alerin began discussing the descent into Perm. But as the crew set the altimeter to the correct pressure, it quickly became apparent that something was wrong. Alerin had input the wrong coordinates into the Flight Management System, FMS, causing the aircraft's position to drift by 1 nautical mile. Normally, this would be a minor issue. The aircraft's Inertial Reference System, IRS, would adjust the position with regular updates. However, there was a problem. The IRS had started to drift due to the lack of nearby navigation stations to correct the errors. This drift would only worsen, and by the time they neared Perm, the aircraft's position on the navigation screen would be as much as 4.5 kilometers off course. Meanwhile, the auto throttle system, which the crew had mistakenly thought was inoperative earlier, was functioning. But this wasn't known by the entire crew, as the captain failed to communicate this oversight clearly. The lack of clear communication and overconfidence in the aircraft's systems began to create cracks in their coordination. At 4:40 a.m., the crew began descending into Perm's airspace. The weather had worsened. Fog and light rain now obscured visibility. The plane was on course, but they were about to encounter even more issues. The approach briefing, a critical step in preparing for a safe landing, was completely skipped. Instead, Alerin attempted to manually program the FMS for the approach, struggling to load the correct route. This delay caused the crew to bypass important discussions about the approach and descent procedure, a serious procedural oversight. At this point, the tension was mounting. The cockpit was quiet, but the crew was beginning to feel the pressure. Medvedev, usually calm, was starting to show signs of frustration. His voice, though steady, had a slight edge to it. Meanwhile, Alerin seemed more stressed than ever, struggling with the unfamiliar systems of the Boeing 737. As they neared Perm, the crew received an important update from air traffic control. The weather conditions were worse than expected, and the cloud ceiling was now down to 240 meters, far lower than ideal for a safe landing. ATC instructed Flight 821 to descend further, down to 2,700 meters, and prepare for the approach to the runway. But there was a problem. The runway assignment wasn't clear. The crew mistakenly believed they were cleared for runway 03, even though ATC had given instructions for runway 21 due to a tailwind issue affecting another departing flight. This misunderstanding was a critical misstep, one that would soon lead to disaster. As the crew continued their descent, Medvedev began to grow increasingly frustrated with the communication from air traffic control. His patience was wearing thin, and the tension in the cockpit was palpable. The confusion over the runway assignment only added to the chaos. Medvedev's irritation was evident when he snapped at Alerin, "You're supposed to be on the radio, not me." This subtle shift in responsibility left Alerin overwhelmed and further stressed. They were now operating under high-pressure conditions with mounting confusion. The crew's miscommunication was compounded by the fact that Alerin was struggling to handle the Boeing 737 systems. He was undertrained and unsure of the plane's operations, particularly when it came to dealing with critical systems like the autopilot and navigation. Medvedev, on the other hand, was now showing signs of fatigue, both physical and mental. By 4:55 a.m., the plane had descended to 2,700 meters and was approaching the runway. However, there was still no clarity on which runway they would land on. ATC's instructions were vague, and the crew was no longer working as a cohesive unit. Alerin, still rattled by the confusion, failed to ask for clarification. In a final attempt to salvage the situation, Medvedev inputted the approach into the FMS. But it was the wrong one. The aircraft was now flying off course, heading for the wrong runway. The plane was descending too quickly, and the confusion in the cockpit was escalating. As the plane continued its descent toward Perm, the runway confusion, Technical errors and strained communication between the crew all came to a head. The situation was no longer under control. What had begun as a routine flight was now turning into a race against time, and the worst was still to come. It was 4:55 a.m., and Flight 821 was descending into Perm, Russia. The weather had worsened with heavy fog and rain, making the approach to the runway even more treacherous. The cockpit, already under stress, was now a place of heightened tension. Miscommunication was turning into chaos. The crew was still unsure about which runway they were landing on, despite repeated instructions from air traffic control. Medvedev, frustrated with the lack of clarity, decided to push ahead with what he believed to be the correct approach. But there was one major problem. He had forgotten to properly brief Aileron on the approach. As the plane descended further, the autopilot engaged in a strange dance, adjusting the throttles asymmetrically. This caused the aircraft's rudder to deflect, but neither pilot noticed the issue. Medvedev was focused on trying to make sense of the complex approach procedure, while Aileron struggled to follow along. Then came the critical error. Aileron, still unclear about the runway assignment, misread the navigation screen. He believed they were still heading for runway 03, even though they had been cleared for runway 21. This misunderstanding left them with no proper course of action, increasing the chances of disaster. The confusion wasn't just limited to the runway. The aircraft's flight management computer, FMC, was still in the wrong mode. The route programmed into the system was completely misaligned with the plane's actual position. The aircraft's navigation system, which was supposed to guide them safely, was failing to correct the growing drift. By this time, the plane's position on the navigation screen was off by about 4.5 kilometers. They were flying on the wrong path, and the pilots had no idea just how far off course they had gone. As the plane continued its descent, the air traffic controller began to notice something was wrong. But by then, it was too late to intervene. The cockpit was tense, filled with radio chatter and the hum of warning systems. Medvedev's frustration was building, and Aileron was becoming overwhelmed by the growing confusion. The captain's earlier frustration had now morphed into a frantic drive to make up for lost time. Medvedev, trying to regain control, was still operating on the assumption that they were heading to the correct runway. He began to issue instructions to Aileron, but his orders were unclear. The plane was now descending too quickly, and the crew was struggling to keep up with the rapidly changing situation. The descent continued, and the situation became even more critical. The plane had now reached an altitude where it needed to be aligned with the runway for a safe landing. But Medvedev, still uncertain of the exact position, began making last-minute adjustments. Meanwhile, Aileron was desperately trying to process the information coming from the cockpit instruments. But the strain of the situation, coupled with the confusion over the runway and the plane's flight path, left him unable to respond effectively. The aircraft was now in a dangerous situation, too low, too fast, and completely misaligned with the runway. The plane was nearing a critical point in its descent. Medvedev's voice cracked through the cockpit, demanding faster responses, but it was clear he was losing control. He shouted at Aileron, "We need to speed up, now!" But the co-pilot, already tense, was too late in reacting. The crew's failure to work as a team, coupled with their growing confusion, set the stage for disaster. The plane was in a steep descent, the runway still nowhere in sight. The ground was rapidly approaching, and neither pilot could get a grip on the situation. As the Boeing 737 plummeted toward the Earth, it became clear that this flight was no longer under control. The confusion between the crew, the failure of systems, and the miscommunications had left them on the brink of disaster. What should have been a routine descent into Perm had become a desperate scramble to regain control, and it was too late. By 5 a.m., Flight 821 was descending rapidly toward Perm. The crew's miscommunication and confusion had already set the stage for disaster. The cockpit was in chaos, with both pilots struggling to regain control of the situation. The ground was approaching, and there was no clear path to safety. In the final minutes of the descent, Captain Medvedev's voice cracked with frustration. "We're going down! Adjust the speed! Now!" he shouted, but his words were too little, too late. Co-pilot Alerin, already overwhelmed, failed to respond in time. The plane's altitude was dropping rapidly, and the autopilot had disengaged. The aircraft, now flying without any stabilizing assistance, began to roll sharply to the right. The yawing motion of the aircraft was compounded by the asymmetrical thrust of the engines, causing the plane to veer off course. Medvedev's attempts to correct the roll only made things worse. His grip on the yoke became erratic. In the cockpit, the warning systems blared, but the pilots were too distracted to respond. Alerin tried to regain control, but the rapid descent, compounded by the confusion in the cockpit, left him unable to manage the plane's movements. As the aircraft banked sharply, the ground rushed up faster than anyone could comprehend. The crew was now in a fight for their lives, but they were too far gone. Air traffic controllers in the tower watched helplessly, unable to intervene. They could see the aircraft spiraling out of control on their radar, but there was nothing they could do to stop it. The crew had failed to maintain control of the plane, and the outcome was becoming inevitable. Medvedev's voice rose in frustration as he tried to stabilize the plane. "Speed up! Speed up!" he yelled, but the aircraft's speed was already dangerously low. The plane's angle of descent was steepening, and the engines struggled to maintain power. At this point, the captain had lost control. His attempts to regain stability were futile. The aircraft continued to bank to the right, exceeding Boeing's 45-degree bank limit. The cockpit's tension was palpable, with the co-pilot frozen, unable to react fast enough. The plane's descent was now uncontrollable. Seconds later, as the plane's bank angle reached 50 degrees, Alerin shouted, "Angle! Angle!" in a desperate attempt to warn Medvedev. But it was already too late. The Boeing 737 was no longer responding to the pilot's commands. The aircraft was beyond the point of no return. In a final frantic move, the captain tried to regain control by pulling back on the yoke, but the aircraft continued its downward spiral, plummeting toward the ground at a horrifying speed. At 5:07 a.m., Flight 821 crashed into the Trans-Siberian Railway, just 200 meters from the nearest houses. The explosion and fire that followed consumed the wreckage, and all 88 souls on board were lost. In that final horrifying moment, the crew had failed. What started as a routine flight had ended in disaster, caused by a deadly combination of miscommunication, confusion, and pilot error. The wreckage of Aeroflot Flight 821 was devastating. Debris scattered across the Trans-Siberian Railway, smoke billowing into the sky. Firefighters and rescue teams arrived at the scene, but there was little they could do. The crash was a complete loss, and all 88 people on board were gone. In the aftermath, the world was left with a chilling question: what caused a healthy, modern aircraft to plummet from the sky in clear weather? Was it a mechanical failure, a terrorist attack, or was there something far more disturbing at play? The first reports from witnesses indicated no explosion, no storm, no bird strike. Some speculated that the plane might have been attacked by terrorists or hit by a missile, but there were no traces of explosives or signs of sabotage. Aeroflot officials quickly ruled out the possibility of an external attack. As investigators combed through the wreckage, they discovered that the plane's engines had been operating normally up until impact. There was no mechanical failure. The aircraft itself was not to blame. Then the focus turned to the crew. Initial checks revealed something shocking. The captain of Flight 821, Rodion Medvedev, had been drinking heavily the night before the flight. In fact, his blood alcohol level was found to be between 0.05% and 0.1%, enough to impair his judgment. Yet Medvedev had passed his medical check earlier that day. How had he been allowed to fly? No one had questioned his condition before takeoff, and he had shown no signs of impairment at the time of boarding. As the investigation continued, even more troubling details emerged. It was revealed that Captain Medvedev had violated rest regulations, having flown several long overnight flights in the days leading up to the crash. This chronic fatigue, combined with alcohol consumption, left him in no condition to fly. Further investigations into the crew's training revealed another disturbing truth. Medvedev's training records for the Boeing 737 were incomplete, and there were rumors that his certification might have been falsified. Worse still, the crew's English proficiency was inadequate for international flights. This lack of preparation and training left them ill-equipped to handle the complex systems of the Boeing 737. The final investigation report concluded that the crash was not the result of a mechanical fault, but a tragic combination of human error and systemic failures. The crew's confusion, poor communication, and lack of proper training were the primary factors. Medvedev's impaired state, combined with Aleren's inexperience with the aircraft, created a perfect storm of mistakes that led to the crash. The investigation also highlighted serious operational and management failures at Aeroflot Nord. The airline had failed to properly train its crew, and Medvedev's alcohol consumption had gone unnoticed by the airline's management, despite the obvious signs. In the wake of the crash, Aeroflot Nord and the aviation industry as a whole took a hard look at their training protocols. The incident sparked widespread changes in pilot medical checks, crew resource management, and cockpit discipline. But for the families of the 88 people who died, nothing could bring them back. The story of Aeroflot Flight 821 serves as a stark reminder of how fragile human lives can be when safety protocols are ignored, and when a series of seemingly small errors build up to catastrophic consequences. What brought down Aeroflot Flight 821 wasn't just a mistake in the cockpit. It was a complete collapse of the systems meant to ensure safety. From the captain's impaired state to the crew's lack of proper training, the disaster was a tragic outcome of neglect and human error. The investigation may have uncovered the truth, but the scars left by this crash will never fade. The story of Flight 821 is one of caution, a painful lesson about the importance of human factors, crew coordination, and safety protocols. If you found this story as shocking and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life aviation mysteries.